Leo Tolstoy, one of the greatest writers in human history, lived between the 19th and 20th centuries in a Russia marked by deep social inequalities, simmering revolutions, and an aristocracy that seemed to live in a golden bubble. He was born in 1828 into a noble family, surrounded by privileges and with access to the best education of his time. With works such as War and Peace and Anna Karenina, Tolstoy achieved worldwide fame during his lifetime. He was revered not only as a literary master, but also as a sage. His narrative talent, his sharp insight into human emotions, and his criticism of social hypocrisy placed him at the top of Russian and European culture. But behind this literary and social success hid a deeply restless man, consumed by a question that would not let him sleep. What is the true meaning of life? This existential crisis deepened around 1879, when Tolstoy was about 50 years old. Despite his public glory, wealth, and a seemingly complete life with a wife and children, he fell into a state of silent despair. He questioned everything: organized religions, carnal pleasures, elite morality, even the logic of death and existence. He felt lost, as if he were living a lie. He wrote in his diaries that he even considered suicide as a solution to this emptiness. It was during this dark period that he began his desperate search for answers, for something beyond human vanity. This phase marked the beginning of a profound spiritual transformation that would completely change his worldview, and also his legacy. Tolstoy began to reject his former privileges and immersed himself in religious texts, Eastern philosophies, and especially in the Christian gospel reinterpreted by himself. A Christianity without church, without dogma, centered on love for others, nonviolence, and radical simplicity. He distanced himself from the Russian Orthodox Church and began writing philosophical spiritual texts, such as Confession, 1882, where he recounts precisely this period of doubt and inner rebirth. His fame grew even more, but now he was seen not only as a brilliant novelist, but as a prophet of peace, inspiring thinkers like Gandhi and Martin Luther King decades later. Tolstoy's period of disorientation was the catalyst for a new life, and this search for the meaning of life became his most enduring work, because it is not just in books, but in the example of transformation he left for the world. During his deep existential crisis, Leo Tolstoy began to see the world around him with new eyes, and that's when he began to deeply distrust the intellectuals and educated elite of Russian society. To him, there was something profoundly false in the way these intellectuals spoke about morality, progress, and justice. In many of them, he saw only pretty words, fiery speeches, and vanity disguised as wisdom. He saw them debating ethics while living surrounded by luxury, criticizing social injustices without ever getting their hands dirty or experiencing the suffering they so often described. Tolstoy felt that these thinkers were disconnected from reality, and behind their sophisticated ideas was a void, an unhappy life marked by existential anguish, romantic frustrations, and pride disguised as refinement. For him, this false intellectualism not only failed to solve the world's problems, but also fed a dangerous illusion that life can be understood solely through reason and books, without ever living it with simplicity and courage. It was then that Tolstoy turned his gaze to those whom almost no one listened to: the peasants. Unlike the intellectuals, rural workers didn't use complicated words, didn't make speeches about morality, and didn't write philosophical treatises, but within them, there was something Tolstoy considered infinitely more valuable: a deep sincerity, a silent peace, and a real connection to life. The peasants woke up early, worked the land, cared for their children, and prayed with genuine faith. Their lives were hard, yes, but also full of meaning. They didn't pretend to understand everything, but accepted the mysteries of existence with humility. To Tolstoy, this humility was a superior form of wisdom. He began spending more time among them, listening to their stories, learning their customs, and drawing inspiration from their way of living. He saw more philosophy in a simple peasant act of kindness than in many books he had read in the great libraries of Moscow or St. Petersburg. The sincerity of the peasants touched Tolstoy in a way that no debate hall or literary circle ever had. He realized that, even without possessions, these people lived with a kind of fullness that the rich never experienced. They had less, but seemed to be more human, more compassionate, more alive. It was this realization that fueled his criticism of private property, the power of the aristocracy, and even formal religious institutions. Tolstoy saw in rural life a kind of concrete spirituality, a silent gospel lived out day by day, far from cathedrals and universities. He began to argue that true happiness can only be achieved when life is based on honest work, compassion, and the absence of vanity. The simple life of the peasants became, for him, not a symbol of backwardness, but an ideal to be followed, a living proof that the meaning of life is not found in theory, but in the daily practice of goodness and the humble acceptance of the human condition. When Leo Tolstoy decided to break with the luxuries and privileges of his aristocratic life, the reaction of his wife, Sophia, and his closest friends was one of shock, anguish, and in many cases, silent outrage. Tolstoy didn't just start preaching a simple life based on manual labor and Christian humility. He actually began to live that way. He rejected titles, refused royalties from his future works, dressed in peasant clothing, and insisted on working the land with his own hands. For a man who had once been a symbol of Russian nobility, this was like a personal and political scandal. Sophia, who had been his faithful partner for years, was devastated by this transformation. She saw their life, with its house full of servants, their properties, the published books, and the children, slowly falling apart. More than that, she saw the very man she had married transform before her eyes, as if a new soul had taken the place of the old Tolstoy. This transition wasn't just philosophical, it was painfully practical. Tolstoy's decision to renounce future literary profits in the name of his ideals caused intense arguments within the family. Sophia, who managed his publications and the financial well-being of the household, watched in despair at the looming threat of economic ruin. She tried to convince him to preserve at least what was necessary for their children, but Tolstoy saw this as material attachment. Close friends also distanced themselves. Some thought he was going mad. Others believed his radical spirituality was a veiled criticism of the very elite to which they belonged. Some tried to persuade him to come back to reason, while others quietly drifted away, uncomfortable with his new moralistic and uncompromising vision. The home of Count Tolstoy, once a vibrant center of literary and political discussions, slowly turned into a silent battlefield between the old world and the new spirit that was being born inside him. Sophia, though still deeply in love with Tolstoy, began living in constant tension. The arguments became increasingly bitter, the silences longer, and the chasm between the two ever more unbridgeable. To her, Tolstoy's renunciation wasn't a gesture of enlightenment, but a gesture of abandonment. She feared he was not only letting go of material things, but also of his family, his commitments, and even his sanity. What Tolstoy called spiritual truth, Sophia often saw as fanaticism, and this difference in vision about life and duty turned their relationship, once marked by mutual admiration and complicity, into a heavy and bitter coexistence. The great tragedy of this phase lies not only in the clash of ideas, but in the human suffering it caused. On one side, a man seeking truth above all else. On the other, a woman trying to protect everything they had built together, including the love that was slowly dissolving. At 82 years old, after decades of worldwide fame, intense family conflicts, and an unrelenting quest for spiritual meaning, Leo Tolstoy reached his limit. Tired of constant arguments with his wife Sophia, the suffocating pressure of aristocratic life that still surrounded him, and the contradiction between what he preached and what he lived, he made a radical decision: to leave. On a cold November night in 1910, Tolstoy secretly left his estate in Yasnaya Polyana. He left behind the house where he had lived for over half a century, his children, his manuscripts, and most of all, the woman who had been his companion for years, but with whom he could no longer live in peace. He carried only a few belongings, his writings, and a quiet desire to live his final days in coherence with his ideals, far from vanity, wealth, and the spotlight, seeking the simplicity and peace he had always preached, but never fully achieved within his own home. Tolstoy had no exact destination. His plan was to find refuge in a monastery or a simple village where he could live out his final days in contemplation and silence. But his body was already frail, weakened by age and the cold. During his escape, accompanied by his doctor and one of his daughters, he took a train heading south of Russia, but midway began to show severe symptoms of pneumonia. Without the strength to continue, Tolstoy was taken in at the Ostapovo train station, where a room was improvised for him in the station master's house. The news of his escape and condition spread quickly, and soon the small station was surrounded by reporters, doctors, onlookers, and family members. But even surrounded by people, Tolstoy was alone. In his final days, he spoke little, wrote almost nothing, and spent most of his time immersed in a dense silence, as if he were saying goodbye not only to life, but also to the world he had always tried to transform. On November 20th, 1910, Leo Tolstoy died in that simple room at the Ostapovo station, surrounded by a scene that symbolized the very contradiction of his life. A man who sought anonymity, but was watched by the world. A defender of humility who had become a myth. A free spirit who never managed to fully free himself from the ties of family, fame, and history. His death was marked by tragic silence, but also by deep beauty. There was no pomp, no luxurious ceremony, only the farewell of an old sage who tried until the end to live according to his conscience. Tolstoy's body was buried in a forest near his former home, without a cross, without a tomb, without plaques, only earth, trees, and silence. An end consistent with the life he so deeply wished to live, simple, honest, and focused on what truly matters. After his death, Leo Tolstoy's ideas did not vanish with him. On the contrary, they grew stronger and crossed borders, religions, political systems, and continents. His criticism of violence, private property, state power, and religious hypocrisy found an echo in a world that, just a few years later, would plunge into the barbarity of World War I. Tolstoy left behind a legacy that went far beyond literature. He became a symbol of a new way of thinking, where individual ethics, nonviolence, and the sincere pursuit of a just life became beacons for the generations that followed. One of his greatest admirers was Mahatma Gandhi, who read his writings with deep reverence and was directly inspired by his philosophy of nonviolence. The correspondence between the two made it clear that Gandhi saw in Tolstoy not just a thinker, but a spiritual master, someone who gave him the theoretical and moral foundation to lead India's independence movement without resorting to arms. But Tolstoy's influence did not stop with Gandhi. Decades later, Martin Luther King Jr., the great leader of the civil rights movement in the United States, would also draw inspiration from Tolstoy's doctrine of peaceful resistance. Alongside Christian teachings and Gandhi's strategies, Tolstoy's ideas shaped the moral foundation of King's struggle against institutionalized racism. King believed that real transformation in society could only occur through the power of love, peaceful civil disobedience, and moral courage, principles that lay at the heart of Tolstoy's philosophy. In addition to Gandhi and King, the Russian writer also influenced Albert Einstein, who referred to Tolstoy as one of humanity's greatest moral guides. Einstein saw in his work not just literary beauty, but an ethical wisdom capable of changing the course of modern civilization. Reaching across the arts, Tolstoy also left a profound mark on cinema, literature, and pedagogy. His ideas influenced educator Anton Makarenko in building an education focused on ethics and the collective good, and they inspired anarchist and pacifist movements in Europe and Latin America. The writer George Orwell famous for works such as 1984 and Animal Farm, also recognized Tolstoy as a restless and powerful thinker, even when he disagreed with his ideas. What united all these names was the recognition that Tolstoy didn't just write about the world. He tried, with all his strength, to live in a way that was consistent with what he believed. And that effort, however painful and contradictory it may have been, left an echo that resonated throughout the entire 20th century, crossing wars, revolutions, and profound cultural changes. Even today, more than a century after his death, Tolstoy continues to be rediscovered by new thinkers, activists, and readers in search of more human answers to the dilemmas of our time. His life, marked by a constant struggle between desire and ethics, between privilege and renunciation, has become a mirror in which we can all see ourselves. His texts are still published, studied, and discussed, not as relics of the past, but as possible maps for a more just, conscious, and truthful existence. Tolstoy's impact lies not only in what he wrote, but in the courage he had to live as he wrote. And that is something rare, revolutionary, and above all, deeply inspiring.